It truly is a tremendous honor to welcome to the podium Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, a true man of his word.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here. William Carlos Williams once said, "It's difficult to find news in poetry, and yet men die miserably every day because of a lack of what's there." And so I begin with words from Maya Angelou that she actually presented 20 years ago at the installation of a president. "Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it, this dream, into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the image of your most public self. Sculpt it into the shape of your most private need. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning. Good morning, Birmingham. Good morning. Now, how many of you are morning people? You are definitely not my students. I want you to know that. I have students on my campus from 150 countries, and they have one thing in common. They do not like the mornings. And so when I'm being bubbly in the morning, they're going, shh, shh. But I am delighted to be home. There's something special. I really do think you can come home again. You can come home and reflect on the significance of those experiences. I begin with this statement, that the way we think about ourselves, the language that we use as individuals, as Americans, as people in Birmingham, for example, the things that are important to us, the way we interact will all shape not only who we are today, but who we will be in the future. I took the time to talk with a few of the teachers to ask, well, what do you want me to talk about? What do you want me to say? And the essence was this. First of all, don't you know by now? You should have gotten your speech together before now. But then they said, well, how do you take things from the civil rights movement and integrate them, as the theme is here saying? And I think Darlene, Phillip, and all the people here at the Vulcan Museum and Park should be given a round of applause for doing this. Give them all a hand, would you please? And here is the message today for me, that there is so much, I think, of richness, so much that can be said about this period in the 60s that can be used in teaching lessons to children. I am often saying that it will be these dreams and values that really shape who we become. And I start with a book that I recommend to you by David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, called A Social Animal. And what he says in the book essentially is that we're all the products of our childhood experiences. That when you least expect it, things that you're doing, the way in which you move, what you say, what you don't say, how you react, will be the result of something that may have happened when you were 12 years old, and you simply don't remember. But we are all the products of our childhood experiences. And if you were to ask me what I think is most important to teach a child of any race, boy or girl, it is to have a sense of self, to develop a culture of hope, to help children believe that they can be empowered to do whatever if they're willing to work hard, and to focus on the goal. You know, it was in the late 19th century in this state that we began to see the beginnings of colleges for black people, schools, higher learning schools. And so you all have heard, there are names that you've heard, and yet one of my messages to teachers today is that when thinking about the history of African Americans and you talk about the 60s, you have to have some historical context. There are people in the room who know a lot about history. One of the big-time teachers at my school was Odessa Woolfolk at Ullman when I was a little boy. She was amazing, and all the smart kids had her in the classes. They always said she was smart, and she had the audacity to leave by the time I got to the 12th grade. I never had it, but they always said she was a smart teacher. And then J. Mason Davis was always a friend to our family and seen as an intellectual. You know, and then actually Kathy Crenshaw Jones has been up to my campus and has done a wonderful job of bridging communities and knowing all of my friends from Birmingham. And there are a lot of you in the room, and you know the importance of history. I often say that Baltimore is the Upper South. One day we think like Philadelphia, the next day like Richmond. But Birmingham is the Deep South. I always say I live in Baltimore, but I'm from the Deep South. In Deep South, we love stories. And I begin with this idea of all these colleges and the impact of those institutions on the thinking of people in this state. Many of the whites may not appreciate the fact that for many middle-class African Americans, places like Alabama State and Alabama A&M and Talladega, a liberal arts college, where J. Mason Davis was chairman of the board for years, and then the most famous of all, Tuskegee, were important not only to the state, but to the entire country. There was no educator, black or white, any more powerful than Booker Washington at the turn of the century in 1900. Mr. Washington was the first African American to sit at the dinner table with President Roosevelt at the time, and presidents over that period from the late 1880s. Tuskegee was founded in 1881, all the way until he died. Actually, people were coming to ask his opinion about things. And what is interesting about that is that as a result of those colleges being founded in that period, with A&M being the land grant, the Morrill Act, the land grant college, what happened was that you had a cadre of teachers produced whose job was to help other children learn to read and to want to be smart. And it was Mr. Washington who not only was going to Washington, D.C., but actually got an honorary doctorate from Harvard with President Roosevelt, an honorary master's at the time, in fact, for him. But what's interesting is that he was also going to little towns in Alabama. And two of the places he visited on horse in the first decade of the 20th century were Selma, and that area, Selma, Alabama, and below Montgomery in a little town called Wetumpka, places where my mom and daddy are from. And all of my life, I heard my grandmothers saying that Mr. Washington's message was very clear and very simple. Send your children to school. Education makes the difference. No time to be a victim. You've got to be twice as good because the world is not fair. But if you're that good, the opportunities will come. And so this was even before my grandmothers had children. And my dad was born in 1910 and my mother in 1916. And interestingly enough, mother being born in 1916 meant she was born right after Mr. Washington died. He died in 1915. But that message had been sent about education. And both my parents struggled, and we were little valedictorians of their little schools in the country. And they always told me stories. And again, stories inspire. If I gave you a theory, you'd lose it. You'd probably go to sleep. You've just eaten, it's dark enough, you'd go to sleep. But if I give you a story, you'll listen to me. My dad would say, boy, you're so lucky you've got somebody to take you to school. This was here in Birmingham years later. And he would say, you know, I had to walk 5 miles to school every day. You've heard those kind of stories, right? I finally got so tired of my dad telling that story. I said, Dad, that's why your feet's so big. To which he responded, boy, don't you get smart with me. But my mother told a story that embarrassed me, and yet I tell it to corporate CEOs because there's such a message there. She said that beginning at age 12, she had a choice of either working in a hot cotton field or going to work in a home as a maid, to help with the work in the home. And she wanted to see how rich whites lived, what she thought of as rich. And she said the distinguishing quality of the home attribute was that there was a library at a time when there was no library for children of color. And this would have been when she was 12, she's late 20s, right? And she said that the woman encouraged her when she finished her work to go and read, and mother would do just that. And the woman was kind enough to say, Maggie, take the book home. When you finish, you can bring it back. All of a sudden, my mother's friends were getting upset with her because they would say, Maggie, come on outside and play. And she would say, no, I want to stay in and keep reading this book. And they would ask one question over and over. Why would you want to keep your nose or your head in that book when you can come outside and play? And that's when she began to see the growing difference between herself and her girlfriends. And here was the difference. And this is critical to the future of our children. She said the more she read, the better a reader she became. And the more proficient a reader she became, the more she enjoyed the experience. And the more she enjoyed reading, the more reading she did. And she said the reading helped her to write more clearly and to speak more clearly. And people began to say she's an unusual little girl, and it developed that sense of self. And she could use that reading to put her own life and the poverty in perspective. And at that point, she knew exactly what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, to become a teacher. The work more noble than any other. She always said, we teach them all. The doctors, the lawyers, they all we teach them all. And she was so proud of that. And so she worked hard and she became that teacher. My dad did the same thing. And interestingly enough, this is significant here at Vulcan, Daddy left education because he could make much more money working at Stockman, Valve, and Fittings. Just true, which is wonderful for the steel industry, pathetic that educators are paid so little, right? You know, and Daddy even did some of the reading and writing as an educated man for some of his white supervisors who didn't have a high school diploma. You get my point? So, I mean, he said, this is the way the world is, son, but you take your skills and you use them. And he also ended up helping a lot of young men of color to go back to school to get their GED. And my mother was teaching in the daytime at Shields Elementary, 8th grade. She was an English teacher and then became a math specialist. But she was also teaching math and English to GED students. And so he would get them to go from literally the steel mills into the GED programs to get them to get that education. So they were still working together. Now, I got my worst grades in my mama's class in 8th grade. I got B's, and she's the only person who ever gave me B's. And my son, who's 34, says, Dad, get over it. You got those B's. It's okay. Get over it. You got the B's, all right? You deserve the B's, all right? He loves saying that. And then he says, Dad, you're not just a nerd. You're a mega nerd. To which I respond, yeah, but grown mega nerds can pay their bills all the time. If you got grown children, you know what I'm talking about. But Mother would say in the middle of our own home years later when she'd become a teacher, she would quote Zora Neale Hurston from the book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his head away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men and women. She was talking about two groups of people like us, people who've had dreams fulfilled in different ways. And then, in the words of Langston Hughes, people whose dreams are deferred. Her point was this, Hurston's point, my mama's point, my point to you. The difference between the ones who get dreams fulfilled and those whose dreams are deferred, education. If we could know that every child, regardless of race, was learning to read and think critically and wanted to be smart, we'd be well on our way. As simple as that sounds. But the challenge we face is that these skills that we see as so valuable and the values that say a child who wants to be smart, that somehow it seems elusive, that we don't get there around the country, not just in Birmingham, but around the country, it is an issue. And unfortunately, for so many children of color, but so many kids in general, if you're not from an advantaged home where people are forced to pushing the books all the time, it's really a challenge to get the child into the reading. And I'm speaking as a math teacher 40 years. You give me a child who can read well, I can teach her to solve word problems. When people tell me, oh, the standardized tests are biased, I say, well, I wrote the questions for the SAT for years. I think I'm black. I think the last time I looked, I was black. I don't think I'm biased. Either you can do it or you can't. You know, I get kids who coming wanting to go to med school, and they don't get in because of standardized tests, and they'll say, well, it's just one test. Why would you penalize? And I'll say this. Suppose you're sitting on you're lying on the operating table, and the physician comes in and says, I like people. And I made good grades. I just can't pass this test, but I'm getting ready to cut on you. I don't think you're going to let them do it. You want to know that they can do it. Now, passing a test doesn't make you a good doctor. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. And my point is, it's the reading skills that will help with the test that they have to take. And so bring all that forward, all the idea of the dreams being fulfilled, the notion from Booker T. Washington to my parents going to school to pushing me, and all of a sudden here I am, a little middle-class kid living in Tittersville in what I would call one of the most wonderful villages there could be. Because it's so amazing, the love, the belief in me, the neighbors who were my parents, knowing that if a neighbor caught me doing something wrong, I was going to get punished twice by that neighbor. Then again, I'd rather for my parent, because the neighbor's going to get on me really. Freeman, all the time, but believing in me, to the church, not just on Sunday, but that idea of spirituality throughout, constantly, right? Reverend and Mrs. Porter coming back from having been away in school and then living in Mrs. Porter, getting a grad degree at NYU in classical music, and Reverend Porter, having gone from Morehouse and preaching in Detroit, coming back in the 60s and being in 62, and he's like 20 years older, and just being inspired by our own leaders in our church, young people who believed in us, and taking piano lessons, and then seeing Mrs. Porter with the most beautiful voice I'd ever heard, and saying, I want a wife just like her because she was so beautiful, right? You know, and just being inspired by these educated people. And so we get to the civil rights movement, and there are two layers. It's so interesting for whites in the room. When I tell you that Birmingham, for me, has, first of all, incredible memories of positive memories, it's because people were determined to make us feel as special as possible and to teach us those values that would help us in American society. When I meet wonderful people of all races who grew up in Birmingham, white, it is amazing to me how much we have in common. Without ever having known. We would never have met in the 60s. And yet when they talk about either whether it's about church, hard work, or about their grandparents or coming from rural areas, or Ollie's barbecue, it's so interesting. And I said, I just couldn't go and sit down, but I could go and, you know, it was very, but you know, just all these different ways, you see the commonality there and the human spirit, especially when you meet people who are from Birmingham, who are white, and all of a sudden you realize all of your parents have died, and you realize the commonality of the human spirit, that people bleed, people die. And all of a sudden, I go back and think, well then, if it was all that kind of wonderful, why did we have a civil rights movement? Because they were doing all of that to try to counter the messages sent by the larger society, not just in Birmingham, but in American society. And you never get over that pit in your stomach because you had this feeling that the world thought you were second class, because you were told that. You saw the white only. You saw the little dirty water fountain for color. So just that notion that for the colored child, that little dirty water fountain, or not being able to go and sit in the place to eat, but giving them your money. My mother was a rebel. I loved it. One of the points that she was most proud of is she was fired as a teacher in a surrounding county because she fought for equalization of teacher salaries in the late 40s. She was just that. They said she was crazy, but she was determined. She said, no. I know I'm a good teacher, and I'm working the same number of hours as my white counterpart. How dare they give me less money? And she was fired. But amazingly, the colored superintendent, some of you don't know, that was a colored superintendent in Birmingham. His name was Dr. Carroll Hayes, Dr. C.W. Hayes. He was my goddaddy. Dr. C.W. Hayes, he was an intellectual. He hired my mama because she was smart. He hired my mama. He knew she was a hard worker and was a reader and a thinker, and went back to get the new math. Remember the new math? Well, my mama, everybody was scared of that new math. One of the reasons, there's some university people here today, one of the reasons the new math didn't do what it was supposed to do was that we in universities have just begun to learn you got to be partners with teachers. You can't go in there trying to tell them what to do. The worst thing you can do is be condescending, because the teachers know the children. College professors don't know children. You know, our students in college is to sit there and do what we say. Your kids can be crazy. You got to work to get on the beat, right? They can get on your last nerve. Am I right? Give me a hand for that. On your last nerve. You know, in my books on raising black males and black females, I sometimes work with minority parents, and they're talking about the teacher didn't do that. And I said, wait a minute. What did you do to help your child learn to read? That's the teacher's job. No, that's your job. Wait a minute. That's your job. Well, I don't know why am I right? Is that the family? We have to teach families that they have a role to play to teach children to respect teachers. Give me a hand for that. The families have to do that. It's very important. Very important. And I finally will say to parents, you know, does your child ever get on your nerves at home? Yeah, well, imagine a teacher with 35 children like that in there. It's hard. It's real hard. So, you know, we got to get there to understand that piece. But I tell you, that because the key here is this, and I want you to think about that. The idea, going back to the civil rights movement, all the way back to trying to counter the negativity by having the positive community of support through the church, through the neighbors and others. And so when all of a sudden Dr. King and others began to say it doesn't have to be this way, it was an amazing thought because it brought about great ambivalence. Why? Well, for those of us who were doing fairly well, for more educated people, yes, we wanted to be better, but we also understand that just a few years before, there were a lot of lynchings when people were not doing the right thing, according to some standards. It was a scary time. It was a very scary time. And for the children to get involved, understandably, parents were saying, I don't trust my children to go to jail to do this. So, I mean, you think about it, would you let your child, I would never allow my 12-year-old to go to jail. When Dr. King was there in that church and was talking, I didn't know who he was. I'll never forget when he said something about, if the children get involved in this march, we'll get to the point where children can go to the best schools and have all the resources that any other American child would have. Well, I like that because I'd always been hearing that these white children were smarter than I was. And I figured smart meant you're willing to work hard. You were excited about ideas. You loved solving math problems, right? And I wanted to see just how smart these white kids were. I was determined to see, because I wanted to be the one to get the 100. I was just that crazy. I wanted the 100 with white children in the classroom. I just wanted to be, why? Because the world was telling me, you're not as smart, right? And so here's the deal. When he said that, I said, who is that man? Because I didn't want to be in church. What kid wants to be in church, right? I'm in the back. And the way my parents would placate me was let me do my math in the back of the room. So I'd be in the back of 6th Avenue doing math problems, all right? You know, all my life, I mean, when my mama became that math specialist, she used me as her guinea pig, and she could always give me incentives by the food I wanted, an extra Big Mac or a blueberry pie. And so I was getting fatter and smarter all the time, right? So I'm sitting in the back doing my math problems, and he said, who is it? And they said, it's Dr. King. And so I said, well, that's what I've got to do. I got to go. I got to be a part of it. Because I had that hope then that it was possible. And I got home, and I said, I'm going to go. I want to go. And they said, oh, no, you're not going. No. He's a wonderful man, great speaker. But no, you're not going. You're not going to, no, you're not. Now, my mama, let my baby go out there and want to hit him in the head. Look at be crazy for the rest of his life. And I looked at them and I said, then you guys are hypocrites. They said, what? Now, at that time, you didn't talk back to your parents. I said, y'all are hypocrites. They said, what do you mean? I said, you make me go to hear this man do something, say something. He tells me what I'm supposed to do, and then you're saying I'm too good to do it. And what did my daddy say? Boy, go to your room. Oh, Lord. I didn't know what was happening then. And all night long, they stayed up and prayed and cried. And the next morning wasn't even sunshine. They came in and sat on both sides of my bed, and they held my hand, and I was getting scared then. I'm saying, what is this? And they wanted to pray. I said, oh, Lord, we're in trouble now. I didn't know what it was. And they just prayed, God, we put him in your hands. It was a powerful moment. And we all cried. I went to the cemetery this morning. I just said, thank you, God, for giving me such wonderful parents. That they loved me so much to let me go. That they had the faith that God would take care of me. And it is such a powerful statement about the families that allowed their children to march, not knowing what was going to happen for the future. It was so powerful, it just really was. I think about it, and I think to myself, what is the lesson that we want to teach children today? It is that they can be a part of the solution, that they must not see themselves as victims, that they need to truly believe they can make a difference. Children, I learned at that point, that children at 12 or 9 or 10 can think more critically than we think, of all races, that we have to empower them and lift them up and expect more from them. You can do this. You can do this. It's amazing what children can do if we just believe in them and keep pushing them in the right direction. And I will tell you this about courage. People can do courageous things and still be afraid. I can't tell you how scared I was. Let me tell you, I was not a strong little macho kid. I was a fat little boy like in mathematics. Do you hear me? That's all I could. I could fight a math problem. I could not fight another kid. When my cousin would fight me, he would kick my butt. Do you hear me? And he said, he lived with me. He said, I'm not going. Them dogs gonna get you. They're not getting me. So but at that point, you get to a point you can't turn around. Right? And you go, and then I saw the little kids. I was younger than some. I was 12, but I was finishing the 9th grade. So I could literally help other children who were younger go. So there's a picture up here with me in the back, and then we get veered off, and I had the little kids because we were going to another place. And what was amazing to me was how community among children is like community among adults and children, that you strengthen each other. Because some of those children, like me, they were scared. you see the big police, you see the water, you see all this, and yet there's power in music. Spirituals were so important. And so, all my lessons, I had piano lessons, and, I could carry a tune, I can't sing, but I had to lead these kids, and it was singing the songs that kept us focused on getting to City Hall. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Keep on a walking, keep on a talking, marching on to freedom land. And then if you could imagine all these children focused and singing, elevated by the thought, the words, the spirit of the songs, and we made it there. And the most challenging part was that it was indeed the case. We were going to go into jail and be put in with the little bad kids. And it was a terrible experience because they were encouraged, the little bad boys were encouraged to kick our butt. It was amazing. It was awful. But the richness of it was this. We learned to support each other and to be the best we could be. And as a result of that experience, after 5 days, I remember in the middle of it, Reverend King came with our parents on the outside and sang songs, and he said this to us: what you do this day will have an impact on generations yet unborn. And the kids were crying, and our parents were crying. You can just imagine how mamas felt with their children locked behind doors. It was an awful feeling of being trapped. And yet there was something about a vision of a better way. We didn't understand the profundity of his words, but we knew there was significance there. And for children to believe that what they do can help others, can make all the difference in the world. I am amazed that as I work with kids in my area and I see a 13-year-old helping an 8-year-old, that sometimes the 13-year-old who can be a little bad kid himself in some ways, but if you give him responsibility to help an 8-year-old, he can rise to the occasion and do far more than you think. And when you can show him an example of a little story about children marching so they can have a better school, so they can have the education they need, the message there is that children can be heroes. Children can be leaders and can think more critically, as I said before, than you ever imagined. And as a result of that experience, we were suspended from school. And I'll never forget George Bell, wonderful, wonderful principal, did not want to put these children out of school at Ullman High School. And he did something that was brilliant. I've used it in talking about leadership. The board said he had to put us out of school. He decided to call the entire student body together. He was not going to put us out and let us kind of sneak out the back door in shame, in disgrace. Rather, he called a meeting of the entire student body, and he had the format of the National Honor Society. I'll never forget this. And because we all felt so bad that we'd been through this experience, and now we're being kicked out of school, not knowing whether we'd be able to come back or not. And the teacher said to me, Freeman, A students shouldn't get kicked out of school. And she was just so hurt that it was happening. But I'll never forget, this is what he did. He called each name to the stage for each of us who had participated in a moment of honoring us. Even though the board had told him, put him out of school, he had this brilliant approach to lift us up. And when we were all on the stage, he called for a standing ovation. Not a dry eye in the place. It was so powerful. He took that moment of disgrace and made it a moment of pride and honor. And he began with tears coming down his face. And he said to us, never stop believing in the vision. And he talked to me about Thoreau and civil disobedience. It was such an amazing story. So when you teach about the Children's March, I want you to go to Thoreau, one of the greatest of American writers, and read about what leaders and thinkers in our country have done for years, and understand that your state, my state, our state, Alabama, has this rich history, such powerful history. The last piece of the story, we got back into school, a federal judge put us back in school, and within a matter of months, the bombing of the church. Awful experience, awful. We're at 6th Avenue, 16th Street, relatives, mothers, children, sisters, brothers, awful experience. And I'll never forget the nightmares thinking about children blown up, little girls in the bathroom, primping in white. And all of a sudden, no more. I think about those 4 girls often. I was asked to represent my school at the funeral at my church. And those 3 coffins of the 3 of the 4, I still dream sometimes about those 3 coffins. But Dr. King said this to those mothers, because there were people who were saying if you all hadn't stirred things up, this wouldn't have happened. There's the ambivalence, you see. There is the difficulty here. This is the price you pay sometimes. He said to them, life sometimes can be as hard as steel. You just don't know. All you can do is your best. All you can do is your best. And yet, even in that moment of darkness, there was such light and hope. It was the first time in my life, in my church, I saw countless whites from around the country, rabbis and priests and ministers from here in Birmingham all the way to New York, who came to say, we are better than this. I saw whites around the country and in this state saying, no, this is not right. We can be better than this. And amazingly, my mama, who had gotten to know some whites who were calling and talking to her, and the idea was, we are better than this. And there is a part of the history we must teach, that it wasn't everybody who was with that level of hatred, that we were all the products of an experience that comes from hundreds of years before, that we all tend to think about things based on what we've seen before. And yet, education allows us to broaden our minds and to ask the questions. You know, Hrabowski, a Nobel laureate, said that when he was growing up in New York, all of his friends' parents would ask them at the end of a school day, what'd you learn in school today? He said, but not my Jewish mother. My Jewish mother would say, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? And the practice of encouraging his curiosity made him the thinker he became. Well, that's what you want to do, whether the child's in the 4th grade or in the 10th grade. That's what you want. Mrs. Goree, Ms. Wolford, was my teacher in social studies, and she had a way of pushing us to ask good questions, of not accepting the status quo. That's what we want people to do, to not accept the idea that because you're poor or black or a woman that it has to be a negative outcome for you, that all things are possible if you can ask the question, see the vision, and then work in that direction. And so I want all of you to think about, teachers, to think about this notion that as you work to integrate this curriculum into this curriculum, the experience of Alabama, the experience of children participating in a demonstration, the experience of things changing in our city, the experience of things being better in some ways and yet challenging in others. Because it is true today that if one gets an education of any race, anyone of any race gets an education, all things are possible. All things are possible. And yet, for so many of our children, black and white, who are poor, who are from families where there is not that emphasis on education, the big question is, will they get the skills? Will they learn to read well? Will they get the values they need in order to be empowered to go to the next level? Are they aspiring to something beyond being a basketball player or an entrepreneurial rapper, right? Because that's the challenge we face for so many of our children, between the drugs and that popular culture. I mean, it is so easy to think, oh, it's not bad like it was before. No, but for those children, it is just that bad. If you've not read FDR's last installation address, and you can see it in the book Freedom from Fear that came out the period 1929 to 1945. It is a fascinating read because it parallels this period right now. He had Social Security Act. We've got Obamacare right now. People were trying, the Congress couldn't get together. They were upset with what Congress passed. They sent it to the Supreme Court trying to overturn the Social Security Act. Before that period, anybody, before 1935, anybody of any race, unless they were from a rich family, was destined to be very poor at the end because there was no retirement, no Social Security, and yet all of you know that as your grandparents got older, they were looking for that Social Security check. It changed America. But he said this, even after that, he said this, it was so powerful. He said, and yet 1/3 of our nation, ill-fed, ill-educated, ill-clothed, just amazingly at the bottom, and America will be judged by that group. That was in the 30s. I would offer to you today, the challenge is still the same. For poor black and white children, for so many, the values, we've got so much to do. And teachers, as my mama said, can make all the difference in the world. You know, at the end of my mother's life, my wife and I had convinced her to come up to Birmingham, to Baltimore. And Mama didn't want to leave because she didn't want to leave 6th Avenue Baptist Church. You just, no church like 6th Avenue, she felt. I said, Mama, I promise you, we've got nice churches there. We got up there, and all of a sudden I realized this brilliant woman who could quote Emily Dickinson, tell the truth but tell it slant, could quote Shakespeare. All of a sudden I realized she had been hiding from us the fact that she had become with dementia. And before I knew it, I could tell she didn't know who I was. You never like to see your mama go downhill like that. And I'll never forget, one day, and I'm an only child, and I'm sitting down on the porch with her in Baltimore, and she looked at me and she said, I know the end is near. Don't want to hear that. I said, what's important to you now? And I was trying not to cry, and she looked at me and she said, with the sweetest smile, relationships. She said, relationship with my God. And she said to me what she said all of my life, hold on to your faith. She said it so much, I just looked at it on her tombstone a few minutes ago, hold on to your faith. And then she said, my relationship with my husband, he's a wonderful man. She forgot Daddy had died 20 years before. And then she shocked me. She said, you know, I have a son. And all of a sudden, my grief turns to anger. I'm thinking she's about to tell me she had a kid when she's a teenager. Never told me about it. Gonna drop this bomb on me and then die. For me to deal with this mess, right? I'm saying, I'm like my students, TMI, too much information. If I haven't had a brother, but you give me a brother now. No. So I'm looking at her real mean like. I'm saying, what are you talking about? And she said, he's a college president. Thank God she was talking about me. But then she gave me the greatest gift, to which I now give it to you. She said this, but you know, I now understand that teachers touch eternity through their students. Teachers touch eternity through their students. Whatever I had to give, she said, whatever I had to give, my lust for learning, my belief in them, my telling them no time to be a victim, be empowered, I leave that to them and I will live through them. Aristotle once said, excellence is never an accident. I love that. Excellence is never an accident. It is the result of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. It represents choosing among a variety of options. And finally, he said this, choice, not chance, determines your destiny. Again, choice, not chance, determines your destiny. Birmingham, what do you choose? Thank you all. Philip said I can have questions?
Let's do some Q&A.
Great.
We do have some time.